The morning sun was barely up when a little girl and her mother stepped off the bus in the wealthy part of town. The girl was only 7 years old. She wore a simple blue dress that her mother had ironed 3 times the night before, making sure every fold was perfect. Her hair was pulled back in 2 neat braids, and she carried a thin folder of sheet music pressed tightly against her chest like it was the most valuable thing in the world. Her name was May, and today was the biggest day of her young life. They stood in front of the Harrison Music Academy, a tall building made of old stone and large glass windows that sparkled in the early light. It was the most famous music school in the country. The best pianists in the world had walked through its doors. Kings and queens had attended concerts here. And now, this little girl from the poor side of the city was about to step inside and try to prove she belonged. Her mother, Leanne, looked down at her daughter and squeezed her hand gently. She was a hotel housekeeper who cleaned rooms for 12 hours a day, sometimes even more when they needed extra money. Her hands were rough from years of scrubbing floors and lifting heavy sheets. But when she touched her daughter's face that morning, her fingers were as gentle as feathers falling from the sky. "Are you ready?" she asked softly, her voice full of hope and worry at the same time. May nodded. Though her heart was beating so fast, she could hear it pounding in her ears. Her stomach felt tight, like someone had tied it in knots. They had waited 2 years for this moment. 2 long years of saving every extra coin they could find. 2 years of Leanne skipping her own meals so she could put that money aside for the audition fee. 2 years of dreaming about a future that seemed almost impossible for people like them. But here they were, standing at the door of that dream. Inside the building, everything was different from the world May knew. The floors were made of shiny marble that reflected their faces like mirrors. Crystal lights hung from the ceiling like frozen raindrops. People in expensive clothes walked past them without a second glance, their shoes clicking sharply on the hard floor. The air smelled like old books and polished wood, a smell that whispered of money and history. A woman at the front desk looked at Leanne and May with cold, judging eyes. She studied their simple clothes and worn shoes. She checked their names on a list and pointed them toward a long hallway without saying anything kind. "Wait there," she said flatly. "Someone will call you when it is your turn." They walked down the hallway and sat on a hard wooden bench outside a large door with golden handles. Other children walked by with their parents throughout the morning. These children wore designer clothes that probably cost more than Leanne earned in a whole month. They carried shiny instrument cases and talked about their private lessons with famous teachers from other countries. Their parents laughed loudly, greeted each other like old friends. They discussed summer trips to Paris and Vienna, cities May had only seen in pictures. No one spoke to May or her mother. No one even smiled at them. It was like they were invisible. Inside the audition room, a man named Richard Hayes sat behind a long polished table. He was the director of the academy and one of the most celebrated pianists of his generation. He had performed in the greatest concert halls across the world, from New York to London to Tokyo. His recordings had sold millions of copies. Critics called him a genius. His opinion could make or break a young musician's entire career with just a few words. But today, Richard was in a terrible mood. He had spent the entire morning listening to children who had no real talent. No spark, no fire inside them. Their parents were wealthy. They donated large amounts of money to the academy every year. They expected their children to be accepted no matter how poorly they played. And Richard had to sit there, smile politely, and pretend to be impressed by performances that bored him to sleep. He was so tired of it. Tired of the politics. Tired of the pretending. Tired of watching music become nothing more than a status symbol for rich families. His colleague, a younger professor named Daniel, leaned over and whispered, "One more audition left." A scholarship applicant from the East Side. Richard sighed heavily and rolled his eyes. Scholarship applicants were usually a waste of time in his experience. They came from families who could not afford proper training or good instruments. They had big dreams but sloppy technique. He had seen it dozens and dozens of times before, and it always ended the same way. "Fine," he said, rubbing his tired eyes. "Let us just finish this and go to lunch." The large door opened slowly, and little May walked in. She looked even tinier inside the grand room with its impossibly high ceiling decorated with paintings of angels floating among golden clouds. A massive Steinway grand piano sat in the center of the room, black and shining like some kind of sleeping giant waiting to be awakened. May had never seen anything so beautiful in all her 7 years of life. Her breath caught in her throat. Richard looked at her and felt a small laugh escape his lips before he could stop it. He turned to Daniel and shook his head with amusement. "She is just a child," he said, not even bothering to lower his voice. "Look at her standing there. She can barely reach the pedals. This is going to be a disaster." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing. He did not have the courage to disagree with the famous Richard Hayes. May heard every single word. Her face turned red with shame, and for one terrible moment, she wanted to turn around and run away as fast as her legs could carry her. She wanted to go back to their tiny apartment, where no one looked at her like she was a joke, like she did not belong. But then she thought about her mother sitting on that hard bench outside, waiting and hoping and praying. She thought about all those double shifts at the hotel, all those skipped dinners, all those nights when Leanne came home so exhausted she could barely keep her eyes open, but still found the strength to sit beside May and listen to her practice on their old keyboard in the corner of their small living room. That keyboard was missing 3 keys that had broken years ago. They could never afford to fix it. So May had learned to play around them, finding ways to make music despite what was missing. She walked to the piano bench with small but steady steps and climbed up carefully. Her feet dangled above the floor like a child on a swing. She could not reach the pedals properly, so she would have to play the entire piece without them. It would make everything harder, but she had practiced for this. Richard checked his expensive watch impatiently. "Whenever you are ready," he said in a flat, an interested voice that made it clear he expected nothing from her. May placed her folder of sheet music on the stand in front of her, but she did not look at it. She had memorized every single note weeks ago. She closed her eyes and took one deep, slow breath, trying to calm the storm inside her chest and her mind. She was not in this cold, fancy room anymore. She was back home, sitting at that broken keyboard with the missing keys. And her father was right beside her the way he used to be before he got sick, before the hospital took him away forever, before her whole world changed and nothing ever felt right again. He had given her that keyboard on her 4th birthday. It was old and cheap and already broken in places, but to little May, it was the most precious gift anyone had ever given her. Her father had taught her the first simple songs with his big, warm hands guiding her tiny fingers. He told her that music was a special language that every person in the world could understand. No matter where they came from or what language they spoke, play from your heart. "Little one," he always said with a gentle smile, "that is where the real music lives. Not in your fingers, in your heart." May opened her eyes slowly. The memory of her father filled her with a quiet kind of strength. Her small fingers found their place on the cool, white keys, and then she began to play. The first notes filled the enormous room, like warm sunlight breaking through dark storm clouds. She was playing Chopin, a piece called Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It was a famously difficult piece meant for advanced adult players who had studied for decades. Most children her age would never even dream of attempting it. But May played it like she had written it herself. Her technique was not perfect. A trained ear could hear small gaps where her formal education was missing. But there was something else in her playing, something powerful and true, something that could never be taught in any classroom or conservatory in the world. There was pain in every note. There was love. There was the deep grief of a little girl who had lost her father far too soon. There was the fierce strength of a mother who worked until her hands bled for her daughter's impossible dream. It was raw. It was real. It was heartbreakingly beautiful. Richard's amused smile vanished completely from his face. He leaned forward in his chair, his eyes growing wide with shock. Daniel's mouth fell open. The other judges around the table stopped writing their notes and simply listened. Frozen in place, no one in that room had heard anything quite like this in many years. The music seemed to fill every corner of the space. Every tiny crack in the walls, every heart in every chest. It told a complete story without using a single word. It spoke of struggle and hope, of terrible darkness and beautiful light, of a little girl who came from nothing but was giving absolutely everything she had. May played the final notes with her whole soul. Then the sound slowly faded away into perfect silence. For a long, breathless moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to breathe. The grand room was completely and utterly still. Richard stared at the little girl in her second-hand blue dress, her small feet still dangling above the floor. His hands, he suddenly noticed, were trembling slightly against the table. He had been playing the piano professionally for over 40 years. He had heard thousands upon thousands of performances from the most talented musicians alive. But this 7-year-old child from the poor side of town had just done something he could not begin to explain. She had made him feel something deep inside, that he thought he had forgotten how to feel long ago. And honestly, that terrified him more than anything had in years. The silence in the audition room stretched on for what felt like forever. May sat perfectly still on the piano bench, her small hands resting on her lap, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. She did not know if the silence was good or bad. She only knew that she had played exactly the way her father had taught her, straight from the deepest part of her heart. Richard Hayes was the first to move. He leaned back in his chair slowly, his face completely unreadable. For a man who always had something to say, he seemed to have lost his words entirely. He picked up his pen and began tapping it against the table, a nervous habit he thought he had gotten rid of years ago. Daniel cleared his throat softly and looked down at his notes, but the page was almost empty. He had forgotten to write anything the moment May started playing. The other two judges on the panel, an older woman named Mrs. Park and a younger man who taught violin at the academy, exchanged quiet glances with raised eyebrows. "Thank you, Richard," finally said, his voice strangely flat. "You may go now. We will inform you of our decision within 2 weeks." May climbed down from the bench carefully, her legs feeling shaky beneath her. She picked up her folder of sheet music and walked toward the door on trembling feet. Just before she stepped out, she turned around and gave a small bow. The way her mother had taught her to show respect, none of the judges said anything else. None of them smiled. May walked out of the room with her head held high, but inside, she felt like crying in the hallway. Leanne jumped up from the bench the moment she saw her daughter. She searched May's face desperately for any sign of how it had gone. But May just shook her head slowly, unable to find the right words. "I do not know, Mama," she whispered. "They did not say anything. They just told me to leave." Leanne pulled her daughter into a tight hug and held her close. "You did your best," she said softly. "That is all that matters. No matter what happens, I am so proud of you. Your father would be proud too." They walked out of the academy hand in hand, back into the bright morning sun. The bus stop was 3 blocks away, and they walked in silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts and fears and hopes back inside the audition room. The judges finally began to speak. "Well," Mrs. Park said carefully, "that was certainly unexpected." Daniel nodded eagerly. "She was remarkable. Truly remarkable. I have never heard a child play with such emotion. The technique needs some polishing, yes, but the raw talent is extraordinary. We have to accept her." Richard said nothing. He was staring at the piano where May had just been sitting, his jaw tight, his eyes dark with something that looked almost like anger. The violin teacher leaned forward. "I agree with Daniel. That little girl has something special, something you cannot teach. We would be foolish to let her slip away." "She is untrained," Richard said suddenly, his voice cold and sharp. "Did none of you hear the mistakes? The timing issues in the third movement? The lack of proper pedal technique?" Daniel frowned. "She could not reach the pedals. She is 7 years old." "Exactly my point," Richard replied, turning to face his colleagues with hard eyes. "She is 7 years old. She comes from a family with no musical background, no connections, no resources. What kind of future could she possibly have here? This institution has a reputation to protect. We have standards. We have traditions that go back over 100 years. Mrs. Park shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Richard, I understand your concerns, but surely talent like this deserves a chance. That is why the scholarship program exists in the first place." Richard shook his head firmly. The scholarship program exists for students who can represent this academy with excellence. Students who come prepared. Students who understand what it means to be part of this world. He paused and looked around the table. That girl does not belong here. She would struggle. She would fall behind. We would be setting her up for failure and disappointment. Or we would be giving her the opportunity of a lifetime, Daniel said quietly. Richard's eyes narrowed. I am the director of this academy. The final decision is mine. He picked up his pen and wrote something on the paper in front of him. Application rejected. That is my decision, and it is final. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt heavy and wrong. Daniel looked down at the table, his hands curled into fists. Mrs. Parks sighed and gathered her papers without another word. The violin teacher just shook his head sadly. None of them had the courage to argue further with Richard Hayes. But there was someone else in that room who had witnessed everything. In the far corner, sitting in a chair by the window, was an elderly woman named Eleanor Chen. She was 73 years old, retired now, but she had once been one of the finest piano teachers in the country. She had taught at the academy for over 40 years before her hands became too stiff with age to demonstrate properly. Now, she volunteered a few days a week, helping with paperwork and occasionally sitting in on auditions. Most of the time, the judges forgot she was even there. Eleanor had watched the entire audition in complete silence. She had seen the way Richard laughed at the little girl before she even touched the keys. She had heard every note that May played, and she had felt something stir inside her chest, something she had not felt in a very long time. In 40 years of teaching, Eleanor had worked with hundreds of students. Some were good. Some were very good. A few were excellent. But only twice in her entire career had she encountered what she called a true gift. A kind of talent that came along once in a generation. Something almost magical that could not be explained by practice or training alone. The first time was decades ago, with a young boy who went on to become a world-famous concert pianist. The second time was today, with a 7-year-old girl in a second-hand dress whose feet could not even reach the pedals. Eleanor watched Richard and the other judges file out of the room, already talking about lunch and their afternoon schedules, already forgetting about the little girl who had just played her heart out for them. She stayed in her chair by the window for a long moment, thinking carefully. She knew Richard well. She had known him since he was a young student himself, brilliant but proud, talented but cold. She understood why he had rejected May, even if she would never agree with it. Richard saw music as a fortress, something to be protected and guarded and kept only for those he considered worthy. He did not understand that true music was meant to be shared, not hoarded. It was meant to lift people up, not keep them out. Eleanor stood up slowly, her old bones creaking in protest. She walked to the audition table and looked at the papers left behind. There it was, in Richard's sharp handwriting, application rejected. She closed her eyes and made a decision. That evening, Eleanor went home to her small apartment filled with books and old concert programs and photographs of students she had taught over the years. She sat down at her desk and opened her address book, flipping through pages of names until she found the one she was looking for. Catherine. Catherine had been Eleanor's student 30 years ago. A shy teenager with extraordinary talent and a gentle soul. She had gone on to become one of the most respected concert pianists in the world, performing in the greatest halls on every continent. Critics adored her. Audiences loved her. But despite all her fame and success, Catherine had never forgotten her old teacher. They still exchanged letters every few months, and Catherine always visited whenever she was in town. Eleanor picked up her phone with trembling fingers and dialed the number. It rang 3 times before a warm voice answered. Eleanor? Is that you? What a lovely surprise. Catherine, my dear, Eleanor said, her voice cracking slightly with emotion. I need to tell you about someone. I saw something today that I have not seen in 30 years. Not since I first heard you play. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Catherine knew her old teacher well enough to understand that she did not say things like this lightly. Tell me everything, Catherine said quietly, and so Eleanor did. She told her about the little girl named May, who came from nothing. She told her about the broken keyboard at home and the mother who cleaned hotel rooms. She told her about the Chopin ballade and the way the music had filled the room like something alive. And she told her about Richard's cold rejection. When she finished, there was a long silence. "I am flying in next week for a charity concert," Catherine finally said. "I want to meet this girl. Can you arrange it?" Eleanor felt tears forming in her tired old eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I can." When she hung up the phone, Eleanor looked out her window at the city lights blinking in the darkness. Somewhere out there, a little girl was probably crying herself to sleep, believing that her dream was over. But Eleanor knew something that May did not know yet. Sometimes, when one door closes, a window opens. And sometimes, that window leads to places more wonderful than anything you could have ever imagined. The rejection letter would arrive at May's apartment in 3 days. But so would something else. Something that would change her life forever. Eleanor smiled softly and whispered into the quiet night. "Hold on, little one. Your story is just beginning." The letter arrived. Leanne found it in their small metal mailbox when she came home from her morning shift at the hotel. The envelope was thick and cream-colored, with the Harrison Music Academy logo printed in gold in the corner. Her hands trembled as she carried it upstairs to their tiny apartment on the 4th floor. May was sitting at her old keyboard in the corner of the living room, practicing the same piece she had played at the audition. She played it every day now, as if playing it enough times might somehow change what had happened in that grand room with the crystal lights and the marble floors. "May," Leanne said softly, holding up the envelope. It came. May stopped playing immediately. She turned around on her little stool and stared at the letter in her mother's hand. Her heart began to race. For 3 days, she had thought about nothing else. She had barely eaten. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the face of that man behind the table. It's the one who had laughed at her before she even played a single note. Leanne sat down on the worn sofa and patted the spot beside her. May walked over slowly and sat down, pressing close to her mother's side. Together, they opened the envelope. The letter inside was short. Only a few sentences. But those few sentences were enough to shatter a little girl's heart into 1,000 pieces. "Dear applicant," the letter began. "We regret to inform you that your application for the scholarship program at Harrison Music Academy has not been successful. We received many qualified candidates this year, and the competition was exceptionally strong. We wish you the best in your future musical endeavors." That was it. No explanation. No encouragement. No recognition of the music that May had poured her entire soul into. Just a cold, formal rejection that made her feel like she was nothing more than a number on a list. May did not cry at first. She just sat there, staring at the words on the page, reading them over and over again, as if they might change if she looked at them long enough. But they did not change. They stayed the same, black ink on white paper, telling her that her dream was over. Then the tears came. They came slowly at first, just a few drops rolling down her cheeks. But soon they turned into heavy sobs that shook her whole body. Leanne pulled her daughter close and held her tight, rocking her gently the way she used to when May was a baby. "I played my best," Mama May cried, her voice broken and raw. "I played from my heart, just like Papa taught me. Why was it not good enough? Why do they not want me?" Leanne felt her own tears falling now, mixing with her daughter's. She did not have an answer. She did not understand how anyone could hear May play and not see the gift that was so obvious to her. But she knew that the world was not always fair. She knew that sometimes, no matter how hard you tried, doors stayed closed. "I am so sorry, my love," she whispered into May's hair. "I am so sorry." They sat together on that old sofa for a long time, holding each other and crying. Outside the window, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. But inside that small apartment, everything felt gray and hopeless. May did not touch her keyboard for the next 2 days. She went to school. She did her homework. She helped her mother with the dishes, but she did not play. The keyboard sat silent in the corner, covered with a thin layer of dust, like a friend she could no longer bear to look at. Leanne watched her daughter with a heavy heart. She had never seen May like this before. Even after her father died, May had found comfort in her music. It was the one thing that always made her feel better, the one thing that connected her to the father she had lost. But now, even that was gone. On the 5th day, after the rejection letter arrived, there was a knock at their door. Leanne was not expecting anyone. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the door, wondering if it was a neighbor or maybe someone from the building management. Complaining about rent again, she opened the door and found 2 women standing in the hallway. One was elderly, with white hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. The other was younger, perhaps in her 50s, elegant and graceful with an air of quiet confidence that made her seem like she belonged in a palace rather than a rundown apartment building. "Mrs. Chen?" The elderly woman asked gently. "My name is Eleanor, and this is Catherine Zhou. We are here to see your daughter." Leanne's eyes went wide. She recognized the name Catherine Zhou. Everyone who knew anything about classical music recognized that name. Catherine Zhou was one of the most famous pianists in the entire world. Her concerts sold out in minutes. Her recordings were played on radio stations everywhere. And now she was standing in the hallway of their tiny apartment building, asking to see May. "I do not understand," Leanne stammered, stepping back in shock. "Why would you want to see my daughter?" Catherine smiled warmly. "Because I heard what happened at her audition. My dear friend Eleanor was there that day, and she told me everything. She said your daughter has a gift unlike anything she has seen in 30 years. Catherine paused and looked directly into Leanne's eyes. "I had to come see for myself." Leanne felt dizzy. She grabbed the door frame to steady herself and then stepped aside to let the 2 women enter. The apartment was small and shabby, nothing like the grand spaces these women were probably used to. But neither Eleanor nor Catherine seemed to notice or care. Their eyes went straight to the corner of the room, where the old keyboard sat under its layer of dust, and then their eyes found May. She was standing in the doorway of her tiny bedroom, staring at the visitors with wide, confused eyes. She did not know who these women were. She did not understand why they were here. All she knew was that strangers did not usually come to their apartment, and when they did, it was rarely good news. "Hello?" "May," Eleanor said softly, kneeling down so she was at eye level with the little girl. "Do you remember me? I was sitting in the corner of the room during your audition. I heard you play." May shook her head slowly. She had been so focused on the piano that day, so lost in her music, that she had not noticed anyone except the judges behind the table. Eleanor smiled gently. "That is okay. I remember you. I remember every note you played. And I brought someone very special to meet you today." Catherine stepped forward and knelt down beside Eleanor. Up close, May could see that her eyes were kind and warm. Nothing like the cold eyes of the man who had rejected her. "May," Catherine said, her voice soft and full of something that sounded like wonder, "I have played the piano my whole life. I have performed in the biggest concert halls in the world. I have heard thousands of musicians, young and old. But when Eleanor told me about you, when she described the way you played, I knew I had to come see you myself." She reached out and took May's small hand in hers. "Will you play something for me?" May looked at her mother, who was standing by the door with tears streaming down her face. Leanne nodded slowly, unable to speak. May walked over to her old keyboard, the one with the 3 broken keys and the faded letters and the memories of her father in every scratch and dent. She sat down on her little stool and placed her fingers on the keys. She had not played in 5 days. Her heart still hurt from the rejection. But something about these 2 women, something about the way they looked at her with such hope and kindness, made her want to try again. She closed her eyes and thought of her father. She thought of his warm hands guiding hers. She thought of his gentle voice telling her to play from her heart, and then she began to play. The music that filled that tiny apartment was not perfect. The keyboard was old and out of tune, and the missing keys forced her to make adjustments. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the feeling behind every note, the love and the loss and the hope that poured out of her small fingers. When she finished, she turned around to look at the 2 women. Catherine Zhou, one of the greatest pianists in the world, was crying. I would like to teach you, Catherine said, her voice thick with emotion. Free of charge. For as long as you want to learn. She paused and wiped her eyes. The world needs to hear you play, May, and I want to help make that happen. May looked at her mother. Leanne had collapsed onto the sofa, her hands covering her face as she sobbed with joy for the first time in 5 days. May smiled. Maybe her story was not over after all. Maybe it was just beginning. The next 3 years changed everything for May. Catherine Jo kept her promise. Every week without fail, she would come to their small apartment or invite May to her beautiful home across the city. Sometimes the lessons lasted 2 hours. Sometimes they lasted 5. Catherine never charged a single penny, and she never made May feel like a charity case. She treated her like a fellow musician, like an equal, like someone whose gift deserved respect and serious attention. The first thing Catherine did was buy May a proper piano. It arrived one Saturday morning on a big truck, carried up 4 flights of stairs by 3 sweating men who could barely fit it through the narrow doorways. It was not brand new, but it was real. With all 88 keys working perfectly and a sound so rich and full that May cried the first time she played it, Leanne tried to refuse the gift at first. It was too much, she said. They could never repay such kindness. But Catherine simply shook her head and smiled. This is not charity, she said gently. This is an investment in something beautiful. Your daughter has a gift that the world needs to hear. I am just helping her share it. And so the lessons began. Catherine did not try to change the way May played. She understood that May's power came from somewhere deep inside. From her memories of her father, from the struggles she had faced, from the emotions that flowed through her like a river. Trying to control that would be like trying to put a wild bird in a cage. Instead, Catherine focused on giving May the tools she needed to express herself even more fully. They worked on technique, strengthening May's small fingers so she could play faster and more precisely. They worked on theory, teaching her to understand the language of music in a deeper way. They worked on interpretation, exploring what the great composers were trying to say and how May could add her own voice to their words. But most importantly, Catherine told May about her own journey, about growing up poor in a small village, about the teacher who had believed in her when no one else did. That teacher, she explained, was Eleanor Chen, and now the circle was continuing, passing from one generation to the next. Music is not just about playing the right notes, Catherine told her one afternoon as they sat together at the piano. Anyone can learn to play the right notes with enough practice. Music is about telling a story. It is about making people feel something, and you may have more stories inside you than most people will ever have in their whole lives. May listened and learned and grew. She practiced every single day, sometimes for hours at a time, until her fingers ached and her back was sore. But she never complained. She never wanted to stop. The piano had become her voice, her way of speaking to the world. And she had so much she wanted to say. As the months passed, word began to spread. Catherine started taking May to small concerts and recitals, letting her perform for audiences of 50 or 100 people. At first, May was terrified. She would stand backstage with her hands shaking and her stomach turning in knots. But the moment she sat down at the piano, the fear would disappear. The music would take over and everything else would fade away. People started talking. They whispered about the little girl who played like someone 3 times her age. They shared videos on the internet. They wrote about her in local newspapers. Slowly but surely, May was becoming known. By the time she was 10 years old, she had performed in concert halls across the region. She had won 3 small competitions. She had been featured in a magazine article about young musical talents. And through it all, she remained the same humble, hard-working girl who practiced on her second-hand piano in a tiny apartment on the 4th floor. But while May was rising, someone else was falling. Richard Hayes, the director of Harrison Music Academy, was having problems of his own. Over the past 3 years, enrollment at the academy had been dropping steadily. Fewer families were applying. Fewer students were winning competitions. The academy's reputation, once the finest in the country, was beginning to fade. The reason was simple, though Richard refused to admit it. He had spent so many years focusing on wealthy families and prestigious connections that he had forgotten what really mattered. He had chosen students based on their parents' donations rather than their actual talent. He had turned the academy into a club for the rich rather than a school for the gifted, and now results were showing. His top students were technically skilled, but emotionally empty. They played the notes correctly, but without any feeling or soul. Critics called them mechanical, robotic, forgettable. Other schools were producing more exciting musicians, winning more competitions, attracting more attention. Richard felt the ground slipping beneath his feet. He had built his whole life around this academy, around his reputation as a maker of great pianists. And now, at 62 years old, he was watching it all crumble. Then came the news that made everything worse. The National Young Artists Competition, the most prestigious music competition for young performers in the entire country, was being held that year in the great concert hall downtown. It was the event that could make or break a young musician's career. Winning it meant instant fame, scholarships to the best schools, and opportunities that most people could only dream of. Richard had been preparing his best student, a 15-year-old boy named Thomas, for this competition for over a year. Thomas was technically perfect, the product of thousands of hours of expensive training. He was supposed to represent the academy, to prove that Richard still knew how to produce champions. But just 2 weeks before the competition, Thomas injured his hand in a bicycle accident. Nothing serious, the doctor said, but he would not be able to play for at least a month. The competition would go on without him. Richard was devastated. He had no other student ready to compete at that level. He would have to withdraw from the competition entirely, a humiliation that would only add to the academy's growing list of failures. And then he heard the name that made his blood run cold: Mei Chen. Competition organizers had been searching for a replacement performer, someone to fill the empty slot. They had found a video online, a recording of a 10-year-old girl performing at a community center. The video had been viewed over 1 million times. People in the comments called her a genius, a prodigy, a once-in-a-generation talent. They invited her to compete. When Richard saw the invitation list and recognized the name, he felt something twist in his stomach. He remembered that day 3 years ago. He remembered the little girl in the second-hand dress. He remembered laughing at her before she even played. He remembered the music that had made him feel things he did not want to feel. And he remembered writing those 2 words on her application: rejected. Now that same little girl was about to perform on the biggest stage in the country. And Richard would be there, sitting in the audience as one of the judges. Forced to watch and evaluate the talent he had once thrown away, he told himself it did not matter. He told himself she was still just a child, still untrained, still not good enough for the real world of professional music. He told himself that raw talent meant nothing without proper education and connections. But deep down, in a place he did not like to visit, Richard Hayes was afraid. He was afraid of what he might hear. He was afraid of what it might mean. And most of all, he was afraid of what it might say about him and the choices he had made. Meanwhile, across the city, May was practicing in her small apartment, her fingers dancing across the keys of her second-hand piano. She did not know that Richard would be judging the competition. She did not think about the man who had rejected her 3 years ago. She only thought about the music, about her father, about making her mother proud. Catherine sat beside her, listening with closed eyes and a peaceful smile. "You were ready," Catherine said softly when May finished playing. "You have been ready for a long time." May looked at her teacher, her mentor, her friend. "What if I make a mistake? What if I forget the notes? What if they laugh at me again?" Catherine reached out and took May's hands in hers. "Then you will keep playing. You will play through the mistakes, through the fear, through everything. Because that is what real musicians do. They do not play for the judges, or the critics, or the people who doubt them. They play for the music itself. They play because they have no other choice." May nodded slowly, feeling the truth of those words settle into her heart. In 2 weeks, she would walk onto the biggest stage of her life. In 2 weeks, she would face the man who had told her she did not belong. In 2 weeks, everything would change, but for now, she simply played. The morning of the competition, bright with gray skies and a light rain falling over the city, May woke up before dawn, her stomach tight with nerves. She lay in her small bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the raindrops tapping against the window. In just a few hours, she would walk onto the stage of the Grand Metropolitan Concert Hall, the same stage where the greatest musicians in history had performed. The thought made her feel dizzy. Her mother was already awake, preparing a simple breakfast of rice, porridge, and tea. Leanne had taken the day off from work, something she almost never did. But today was different. Today, nothing in the world could have kept her away from watching her daughter. Catherine arrived at their apartment at 9 o'clock, dressed elegantly, but with the same warm smile she always wore. Eleanor was with her, moving slowly with her cane, but refusing to miss this moment for anything. "How do you feel?" Catherine asked, sitting down beside May on the old sofa. May thought about the question carefully. "Scared," she admitted, "but also ready. I think I am ready." Catherine nodded and squeezed her hand. "You are more than ready. You have been ready since the first day I heard you play. Today, you just need to do what you have always done. Play from your heart. Tell your story. Let the music speak." They drove to the concert hall together. The four of them squeezed into Catherine's car. The streets were busy with weekend traffic, and May watched the city pass by through the rain-streaked window. Somewhere out there, thousands of people were going about their normal lives, unaware that a 10-year-old girl was about to step onto a stage that could change everything. The Grand Metropolitan Concert Hall was even more beautiful than May had imagined. The building was old and grand, with tall columns and carved stone decorations that made it look like a palace from a fairy tale. Inside, the main hall had 3 levels of seating covered in red velvet, and a ceiling painted with angels and clouds that reminded May of the audition room where her journey had begun, but this time, she was not a nobody begging for a chance. This time, she had been invited. There were 12 competitors in total, all of them older than May. The youngest besides her was 13, and the oldest was 17. They came from the best music schools in the country, trained by famous teachers, supported by wealthy families. They looked at May with curiosity and confusion, wondering what a small girl in a simple dress was doing among them. May did not pay attention to their stares. She found a quiet corner backstage and closed her eyes, running through the music in her mind. She thought about her father, about the old keyboard with the missing keys, about all the nights her mother had worked double shifts so she could chase this impossible dream. The competition began at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, one by one. The competitors took the stage and performed. Some were technically brilliant, their fingers flying across the keys with perfect precision. Others were more emotional, trying to move the audience with dramatic gestures and intense expressions. The judges sat in the front row, taking notes and whispering among themselves. Richard Hayes was among them. He had arrived early and taken his seat without speaking to anyone. He looked older than he had 3 years ago, his hair grayer, his face more lined. The past few years had not been kind to him. His academy was struggling. His reputation was fading. And now he was sitting here, about to judge the girl he had dismissed as nothing. When May's name was finally called, a hush fell over the audience. People craned their necks to see the small figure walking onto the stage. She looked so young, so tiny compared to the massive grand piano waiting for her. Some people smiled with amusement. Others shook their heads in doubt, but in the third row, Leanne sat with her hands clasped together and tears already forming in her eyes. Beside her, Catherine and Eleanor watched with quiet confidence. May climbed onto the piano bench and adjusted it carefully. Her feet could reach the pedals now, though just barely. She had grown in the past 3 years, but she was still small for her age. She placed her hands on the keys and took a deep breath. The hall fell completely silent, and then she began to play. She had chosen a special program for today. It started with Chopin, the same ballade she had played at her audition 3 years ago. But now, her technique was polished and refined, every note perfectly placed, every phrase beautifully shaped. The music filled the enormous hall like sunlight flooding through an open window. But she did not stop there. the chop-in flowed seamlessly into something else, a piece that no one in the audience had ever heard before. It was her own composition, a work she had written over the past year with Catherine's guidance. She called it Letters to My Father. The music told a story without words. It spoke of love and loss, of memories and dreams, of a little girl who had lost her father too soon but had found a way to keep him alive through her music. It was tender and sad and beautiful and hopeful all at once. People in the audience began to cry. They could not help it. The music reached inside them and touched something deep, something they had forgotten they even had. Richard Hayes sat frozen in his seat. His pen had stopped moving. His notes lay forgotten on his lap. He was staring at the small girl on the stage, and for the first time in many years, he felt tears burning in his eyes. He remembered laughing at her. He remembered calling her just a child. He remembered rejecting her application without a second thought because she did not fit into his narrowest idea of what a musician should be. And now, that same child was playing music more beautiful than anything he had heard in his entire career. The final notes of May's composition faded into silence. For a long moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The hall was completely still. Then the audience erupted. People jumped to their feet, clapping and cheering and crying. The applause was deafening, wave after wave of sound crashing against the stage. May stood up from the piano bench and gave a small bow. Her face flushed with emotion. In the third row, Leanne was sobbing openly, her whole body shaking with joy. Catherine had her arm around Eleanor, both of them smiling through their tears. The judges announced the results an hour later. May had won first place. It was not even close, as she accepted her trophy on stage. Cameras flashing and people cheering. Richard Hayes stood up from the judges' table and walked toward the back of the hall. He needed air. He needed to think. He needed to understand what had just happened. He found May backstage after the ceremony, surrounded by her mother and her teachers. He stood at a distance for a moment, watching them embrace and laugh and cry together. Then he took a deep breath and walked over. The small group fell silent when they saw him approaching. Leanne's face tightened. Catherine stepped slightly in front of May, protective and watchful, but Richard held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I am not here to cause trouble," he said quietly. His voice sounded different than before, softer and more humble. "I am here to apologize." He looked directly at May, forcing himself to meet her eyes. 3 years ago, I laughed at you before you even played a single note. I rejected you because you did not fit my idea of what a proper musician should look like. I was arrogant and foolish and wrong. He paused, his voice cracking slightly. What you played today was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. You have a gift that cannot be taught or bought or manufactured, and I almost kept the world from hearing it. May looked at this man who had once made her cry, who had made her doubt herself, who had almost destroyed her dream before it even began. She could have been angry. She could have been bitter. She could have turned away and refused to accept his apology. But she thought about what her father had always taught her. She thought about kindness and forgiveness and the courage it takes to admit when you are wrong. Music is not about where you come from, she said softly. It is about what you have to say. And everyone deserves a chance to be heard. Richard nodded slowly, tears finally spilling down his weathered cheeks. It was the most important lesson he had ever learned, taught by a child he had once dismissed. Years later, May Chen would become one of the most celebrated pianists in the world. She would perform in the greatest concert halls on every continent. She would win awards and break records and inspire millions of people with her music. But she never forgot where she came from. She started a foundation that provided free music lessons to children from poor families. Children who might otherwise never have a chance to discover their gifts. Above the piano in her home, she kept 2 things. The first was a photograph of her father, smiling and young and full of life. The second was a framed copy of the rejection letter from Harrison Music Academy, a reminder that closed doors are never the end of the story. Some people tried to lock her out, but May had learned something important. When the door is closed, you do not give up. You sit down at the piano and you play your way through.